Hi everybody, I'm Lauren Byrne. I am a researcher from the HDYO Centre at University College London, and I'm also part of HDYO, or the Huntington Disease Youth Organisation. I'm going to assume everybody can hear me okay, and if not, someone can contact me. So I have the pleasure of presenting a new initiative by HDYO called the Juvenile-Onset Initiative for Huntington's Disease. And my talk is titled Stand Up and Join HD. So just a bit about HDYO in case you are not aware of the organisation. HDYO has been transforming the lives of young people that have been growing up impacted by Huntington's disease, and really ending some of the stigmatism and secrecy within families. And our real mission is to support and educate and empower. I want to make this as interactive as possible, and I want family members to have give feedback and ask questions. So I'm going to ask now. Please feel free to send questions throughout the talk, and I will have time towards the end to answer them. Yeah, we're really keen to get as much feedback from the family community, as this initiative is to be patient and family driven, and for them and have them very much in mind from the beginning. So I don't really need to introduce Huntington's disease, or Huntington's chorea as it used to be known, because of this motor dysfunction or motor disorder called chorea, which looks a bit like this. This is an extreme case, and you can see the jerky, dance-like movements. And we know that this has been changed in subsequent years to Huntington's disease, because it doesn't focus on all the other aspects of Huntington's that we know, this triad of symptoms, including behavioral dysfunction and cognitive dysfunction. And something I wanted to highlight very early on is that there's a long history of a collaboration between family members and Huntington's researchers, and a particular example of that is the movement to find the gene, which was published in this paper in 1993. And you can see here that the authorship is just the Huntington's Disease Collaborative Research Group, which if you're not in academia, you might not know that that's quite rare, and to have so just a bit about that time. This was led by the amazing Nancy Wexler. If you don't know who she is, please look her up. She's from a Huntington's family herself, and we spearheaded this collaborative effort to find the gene back in the 70s and 80s, with some of the tools that were really fundamental and foundational to the future of genetics, and the all the talks that you had already about, and we've heard already about, in potential therapies now, looking at therapeutics that are all targeting the Huntington gene. This really stems from a lot of this work. But she got together a whole global effort to find the Huntington genes, and combined 58 scientists as well as over 1,200 family members across the globe. And that's why we have the single gene. We know the single cause of Huntington's disease is this DNA expansion of CAG repeats in the Huntington gene. And it's one of the reasons why we call Huntington's disease the most curable and curable brain disease, because unlike other brain diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, every single case of Huntington's disease is caused by the same genetic mutation. And we know now that it's the gene that is the recipe for making a protein, which we call the Huntington protein. And the actual mutation is an expansion of these genetic letters called CAG. And we know that over 36 causes leads to this mutated or mutant Huntington protein, which is really the bad guy that does does all the toxic things to our brain cells and causes brain cell death. So we know that there's a strong relationship with the length of someone's CAG and their age of onset of motor symptoms. So you can see in this graph that there's a clear relationship as the length of CAG repeats get longer, then the chances of earlier onset increase a lot. And you can see here in this 40 to 45 repeats, which is actually the most common repeat length in HD patients, that there's a huge range of age of onset, where in some of the small 40 repeats could be anything from age of 40-year-old or to 80 years of age. But as you can see, when the repeats get more extreme, there's less variability, and when we're getting to over 70 repeats, it's almost definitely what we call juvenile onset HD. And although I would not call it a different disease, but we often see a different manifestation of symptoms. Juvenile onset Huntington's disease often has this more slowing of movements called bradykinesia, or sometimes called Parkinsonian disorder, because you have much more slowness and stiffness of movement, rigidity, and which is quite different from, as you saw before, the hyperkinetic movements that we see in adult onset Huntington's disease. So you could also see in that previous figure of the links that there's a lot less data points in the people in juvenile onset Huntington's disease, and that's because it's extremely rare, more rare than Huntington's itself, and because of that we have a huge lack of disease knowledge and research that is done. So this lack of disease knowledge contributes to difficulties in being diagnosed. Also, lack of treatments and therapeutics, which we know is still a problem for adult onset disease. And also drives isolation of families and caregivers, because they might never meet another family that are impacted by juvenile onset Huntington's disease, which can be the case in adult onset, but is even more striking in juvenile onset HD. So how do we get therapies and drugs and all this to happen? We need to do more research, and it's been research studies since the gene has been found in 1993 that has led to all these trials and things that we have for adult onset disease, because we now have a deeper understanding of the natural history of adult onset Huntington's disease. And there's been very little work done for juvenile onset, apart from the wonderful Peg Nopolis and her team in Iowa that have done this groundbreaking study in children at risk and with juvenile onset Huntington's disease. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So what about patient registries? And this is kind of patient registries have been used in a lot of rare diseases, and what they are is where people or doctors can sign up and provide information of these rare diseases into kind of a platform. And what it does is helps find subjects for trials, help understand the disease better, and helps drive research. So JoHD is the Juvenile-Onset Initiative for Huntington's disease, and it is the first global patient registry for juvenile-onset Huntington's disease specifically. And what we're aiming to do is connect with JoHD families, and as well as connect them with each other and other healthcare professionals. We want to increase the knowledge of juvenile-onset Huntington's disease and identify any unmet needs in not only the care and awareness, but also potentially driving clinical trials, and we hope to facilitate future research as this being a platform where people can work with us to study juvenile onset Huntington's disease. So who's involved? So I am the JoHD chief investigator, and that just means I am the main researcher who's responsible for the conduct of this study, or this registry. But we have a wonderful team at HDYO, including Dr. Bonnie Hennig-Trestman, who's the co-chair of the research committee with me at HDYO. And we have our wonderful JoHD study coordinator, Rebecca Mason, who will be the main point of contact for any patients and families that want to get involved in the study. To make sure this work is scientifically sound and that we are designing it with a lot of rigor, and to make sure we can get real meaningful information from these patients, we have put together a scientific oversight committee. You might recognize Martha Nance here, but we also have different individuals from around the world, including Jean-Marc Bergender, Oliver Quarrel, Leon Durr, Helen Santini, and Benjamin Wolfund. And they all provide their own expertise that really advance our knowledge base to drive the study forward. So the design for JoHD, we can see here is we have a pre-enrollment stage and then 3 main stages where we're going to collect information of individuals. We're currently in the pre-enrollment stage and very, very close to launching stage 1. In these stages of pre-enrollment, we are asking people about their demographic information, their age, gender, where they're from, and their contact information. And all of this will be held separately from the information that we are going to collect in the main online portal. And stage 1 will really be to recruit and link people with the HD community. So we are going to ask questions about how connected these individuals are, and we will use this as a kind of mapping exercises to find where these families and patients are around the world. And later stages, which are still to be developed and taken further, in stage 2, we will ask about the experiences of JoHD patients and get a medical history and get experience of how, or understanding of how their experience of being diagnosed and what their symptoms are like. And then in stage 3, we will have specialist clinicians that we're working with around the world who are experts in juvenile onset Huntington's to do a clinician-led interview and take a family history. And there is options for this to expand in later years. Sorry. So what is the participant experience to get involved? So participants can pre-register or pre-enroll, as I mentioned before, and I'll share the link in a couple of slides, and it will be available in our poster, which is in the poster pavilion. So participants pre-register, then our study coordinator, Rebecca, will send out information sheets, or what we call a participant information sheet, and arrange a screening call with you to talk about the study and just to make sure that we know that you are either a JoHD patient or a caregiver of a JoHD patient. The participant then, whether that's a caregiver or the JoHD patient themselves, can self-enroll onto the JoHD platform, and they can then complete the questionnaires for themselves. So this is all the options of where you can access the pre-registration. So we have our HDYO website, which has a page on JoHD and the Juvenile-Onset Huntington's Disease Registry. There's also our email signatures. You'll find a link to JoHD, and we also have the website here on the slide. You can fill in the Microsoft Forms document, or find the QR code on this presentation, and also in our poster in the poster pavilion. So just to talk a bit about our recruitment plans and why we feel at HDYO we have a strong position to help drive this, the finding these JHD patients. We have a huge network of not only other HD family charities and associations, we're also strongly connected with the clinics across the globe, and on our social media and websites, we are strongly connected with families and support groups. A key driver of this recruitment, though, will also be word of mouth and be driven by the participants in the study itself. So we really want our participants to be our strongest advocates and to tell other family members or other people that they might know that they're connected to in the juvenile onset Huntington's disease community, to pass on information and get them to sign up. This is just an example of some of the pre-registrations we have, and we can see this is already a true global initiative, and we have some sign-ups already from places that don't have a lot of Huntington's disease research, such as Iraq and Pakistan, but obviously we see a bit more in the USA and England at the minute, but we hope to keep building on this. So please stand up, join HD. You can contact Rebecca to ask more about it, or just sign up or pre-register by following this QR code or looking at our website. So I'm going to take a spin off here to talk a bit about some of the things I'm working on as a HD researcher. So I am a volunteer for HDYO on the Board of Trustees, but I also work as a HD researcher in my day job at UCL and work in what we call biomarkers. Because I'm very interested in how we can measure signs of disease progression in Huntington's disease. This is just an example which has been talked already in this conference, the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale, which was developed by HSG a few years ago. But this is what we call a clinical rating scale, where a doctor will assess the neurological symptoms that are specific to Huntington's disease. And they would ask the patients to do things like tap their fingers or walk in a straight line or hold their tongue out for 10 seconds, and then rate each of those aspects out of 1 to 4 and come up with a score. You can imagine that these are very useful when you have symptoms in this, what we call disease manifest stages, but they are not particularly useful when people don't have what we call overt clinical symptoms. So if we want to really move the benchmark for disease outcome, and to really slow down or even prevent Huntington's disease from happening, we need really sensitive tools that might be able to detect things in this early pre-manifest stage before people have any clinical decline. So that's why I'm interested in biomarkers, and this is the official term, a defined characteristic that is measured as an indicator of normal biological processes, pathogenic processes, or responses to an exposure or intervention. But really all this is stuff that happens in your daily healthcare. If you were diabetic, you would check your blood glucose levels. If you were diagnosed with cancer, they would be checking your tumor size. And then there's things like blood pressure that monitor your heart disease. And these are all examples of how biomarkers are actually integrated now into daily clinical care. And I work specifically with what we call biofluids, and that can be anything from saliva, urine, and blood, but also something like cerebrospinal fluid. I'm particularly interested in blood because of some interest in research that we did at UCL with this protein called neurofilament light protein, so NFL. And we've presented this a few times, but neurofilament light is this protein in green, and this is a neuron, and you can see that it lights up in all of the neuron. So it is a protein that helps our neurons keep their shape, and it's kind of like a structural scaffold for our brain cells. And when there is damage to the brain cells, it gets released into the spinal fluid, and with really sensitive technology, we can now measure it in blood. And a few years ago, we showed that if this protein is elevated in people with the Huntington's disease gene, this is adult onset, and even in this early, over 15 years from their, or over 10 years to 15 years from their predicted onset of symptoms. It also had this striking relationship with the genetic mutation, the CAG repeat, where that higher the CAG repeat, the neurofilament would increase much more steeply and earlier in the disease course. A single measurement of blood neurofilament was related to how much brain cell loss there would be over the subsequent 3 years. And it also was predictive of who developed symptoms, who of the pre-manifest people developed symptoms in the subsequent 3 years. And we've done other work to compare this neurofilament in both CSF, the spinal fluid, and blood with the Huntington protein. And we see that neurofilament has a stronger relationship with clinical measures as well as brain volume measures. They're all stable. And one key thing was that the biofluid biomarkers seem to be some of the earlier detectable changes in Huntington's disease. And recently we've looked at the longitudinal dynamics, and longitudinal just means being measured multiple times within the same subject. So you can see these points that are connected. They're in the same individual over 2 years, and you can see the change then in these different biomarkers. And what was evident is that the trajectory, or how neurofilament changes in gene carriers of Huntington's disease, is quite striking and separate from that in controls. So I'm going to go back to the Kids HD study and Kids JoHD, and this is work that I have been collaborating with Pagnopoulos and her team in Iowa, and Jordan Schultz. But we measured this same neurofilament-like protein in juvenile-onset HD and showed that it is, as with adult onset, it is significantly increased or higher in people in those who have juvenile-onset Huntington's disease, and we see a strong diagnostic ability to of neurofilament levels to differentiate between juvenile-onset and healthy control children. And why this might be important for JoHD, there's a lot of difficulties in getting a child diagnosed with juvenile-onset Huntington's disease, and if you speak to any parent who has a juvenile-onset HD individual, they will often talk about the struggles of how you get their child diagnosed. And this is because of the difficulties in the symptoms that come on, because when the symptoms happen in a brain that's still developing, it can get very confusing to differentiate things that are specific to Huntington's disease and juvenile-onset Huntington's disease, or another developmental disorder or learning difficulty. And there's also the ethical considerations that are at play for testing and minor. As a lot of you will know, someone can only get tested over the age of 18, and this to test a child, you need to be really sure whether they have something neurological wrong with them. Otherwise, you risk testing them and they might not have juvenile onset Huntington's disease, but then you find out they have a CAG repeat that might lead to adult onset, and you've taken away their choice to have that information. So we could potentially use this as a screening tool, perhaps in the future, to make that decision of whether to do the genetic test, because if there was neurofilament elevation, that would suggest something neurodegenerative is happening, and give a lot more robust evidence to warrant doing the genetic test. And this is something I'd like to explore in the future. I'd also want to maximise what we can do with JoHD, and something I'm hoping to develop in the future is developing a home testing method for blood neurofilament light. And I'm planning to link this with JoHD participants in the future, and I'm interested to know what people think about that and whether they would think it's feasible to do a blood test at home and collecting their own blood or their child's blood through finger pricks. So please do let me know. And just to finish things up for the presentation, before it get to answering some questions, I just want to reiterate, we really need you, and by you I mean the families and caregivers. Please, if you know anyone with juvenile-onset Huntington's disease or anyone who's a caregiver, please let them know about this study. We really want to know what challenges do you foresee for juvenile-onset HD or caregivers taking part in a remote study or an online study like JoHD. Do juvenile-onset Huntington's disease patients have any more difficulties giving blood or getting blood taken? What do you think is important to study for or to investigate in juvenile-onset Huntington's disease? And most importantly, will you join HD? And on that note, I'd like to thank everybody involved, our Scientific Oversight Committee and the Family Advisory Group, our wonderful sponsors who have been providing the financial support so we can conduct the study, in particular the JoHD families who are the driver for all this work, and all of the staff and volunteers at HDYO. I'd like to give a special thanks to Kat Martin, our previous executive director of HDYO, who really was the driving force to starting this initiative, and it's a pleasure for me to be taking it further. So I thank you all for your attention, and please do ask questions. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. We have Martha saying, I'm excited. Can I sign up today? Tell me again what website to go to in order to sign up. So please go to the HDYO website, that is hdyo.org, and you will find there a signpost to the JoHD registry, and there's a sign up link there. You can also contact Rebecca, our study coordinator, and that's Rebecca at hdyo.org. How many people do you think will sign up for this registry, and will it give those people priority getting into a clinical trial? So we're hoping the fact that we have access to people in their own homes will break down some of the barriers that have been mentioned, I think, with my HD story, which are particularly evident for juvenile-onset Huntington's disease. We're hoping that will allow us to find people who are not connected with clinics and not that don't have that access. We are expecting to have over in the hundreds of people that eventually, and that's the target that we'd like to achieve. It's thought that juvenile onset HD is about 5% of all cases of Huntington's disease, which is already a rare condition. So we're hoping we can get a more accurate number and of the prevalence rates as well. Yeah, so we're hoping combining all of the countries. And I didn't mention we are translating all of this into some of the main languages that we work with. So definitely on the priority list is Spanish, and I think some of the European languages, and that will be kind of rolled out over the next year for the first stage. I don't know if I have any more questions. Please don't be shy. I think I might be finished way early if we have no more questions. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening, and please do get in touch if you've got any other questions after. You can contact myself or Rebecca. It's a real pleasure to be able to advertise the study and be at the stage where we can start recruiting people. Thanks very much.